The sun had barely crested the jagged peaks of the rocky horizon when Dr. Margaret Whitfield rode into Dry Creek Valley, her horse stumbling over the loose gravel, nostrils flaring at the crisp morning air. She had traveled 3 days from the nearest town, following a series of urgent letters and desperate requests from a dying man named Jonathan Callahan, a rancher whose family was on the brink of losing everything: land, livestock, and life itself. Margaret had never met him, yet she knew the stakes. A fever was ravaging his household, and the local remedies, herbs, poultices, even prayer, had failed. 2 of his children were weak with malnutrition, one of them coughing up blood, the other too frail to stand. The ranch hands had abandoned the farm, leaving the family isolated and vulnerable. The doctor had seen this before, countless times across the frontier. Pride, fear, and desperation could kill faster than disease. She dismounted at the edge of the homestead, her boots crunching on frost-hardened dirt. The house was a simple wooden structure, smoke curling lazily from a crooked chimney. The door opened before she could knock, and she was met with the hollow eyes of a woman who had cried herself into exhaustion. "Are you—" "The doctor," the woman whispered, her voice ragged. "I am," Margaret said gently, adjusting the leather satchel across her shoulder. "Tell me where they are." The woman led her inside. The smell of sickness hit Margaret immediately: sweat, fever, and the faint iron tang of blood. On the main floor, a boy of 8 shivered under a thin blanket, while a girl of 10 leaned against the wall, her small frame nearly disappearing in her mother's embrace. And there, in the back bedroom, lay Jonathan Callahan. His skin was waxen, his breathing labored, each exhale a painful groan. "I don't know if he'll make it," the mother said, tears streaming. Margaret knelt beside the man, examining his pulse, his eyes, the pallor of his lips. The fever had ravaged him. His body fought against infection as if it were an uninvited enemy. She whispered instructions to the mother, moving quickly, precise, her hands steady as she cleaned, dressed, and administered doses of medicine she had carried. Hours passed as the sun climbed higher, but the fever only worsened, and Margaret realized the grim truth. Without a significant intervention, Jonathan would die within days. Then, after long minutes of silence, Margaret spoke. "There is one way to ensure the family survives." She looked into the mother's desperate eyes. "Legally, there's a way you can protect them, but it will require marriage." The room fell silent. "You're saying—" the mother stammered. Margaret nodded. "I must marry Jonathan. It's the only way to secure the land and protect the children from losing everything if he dies." The mother's eyes widened with shock, disbelief, and then relief. "But you don't know him." "I don't," Margaret said, "but I know the stakes, and I can save him." Jonathan groaned weakly, opening his eyes. "What? Marriage?" he rasped. "I will marry you," Margaret said firmly, "so that your family is protected, and I will do everything to nurse you back to health." He stared at her, barely able to speak, the fever clouding his mind. "Why? Why would you?" "Because it is the right thing," she replied softly. "Your children will survive, your home will stay intact, and perhaps you will survive as well." It was a desperate gamble, a frontier act of law and compassion intertwined. The mother wept, clasping Margaret's hands. Jonathan's gaze softened, a faint gratitude flickering through his pain. They married that very evening, the ceremony hastily conducted in the small parlor. The local minister, traveling through the valley, performed the rites with solemnity, while the children clung to their new stepmother with a mix of fear and awe. Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She was not just a healer, she was now the lifeline of this family. For days, Margaret tended to Jonathan with tireless dedication. She fed him, medicated him, and spoke to him in soft, encouraging tones. Slowly, the fever began to break, though his body remained weak. his mind clouded with dreams of the life he might lose. And as the days turned into weeks, something unexpected happened. A connection grew between them, not the forced legal arrangement that had brought them together, but a bond forged in shared struggle, vulnerability, and quiet admiration. Jonathan watched her work, noting the gentle firmness in her touch, the way she spoke to his children, the way she smiled when she thought no one was watching. He realized he had never seen anyone so dedicated, so selfless. His heart, heavy with sickness and fear, began to open in ways he had never imagined. One evening, as Margaret sat beside his bed, adjusting the cooling compress on his fevered forehead, Jonathan whispered, I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," she replied. "Just focus on living. That is all the thanks I need. But the frontier has a way of testing even the strongest hearts. Word spread through Dry Creek Valley of the doctor who married a dying rancher. Some neighbors whispered of greed, suspicion, and ulterior motives. They questioned Margaret's intentions, their eyes sharp and judgmental. Yet the children loved her instantly, clinging to her side, trusting her in ways their father could no longer manage. And as the weeks passed, the bond between Margaret and Jonathan deepened. Small moments, a shared laugh, a hand held to steady a trembling arm, whispered encouragements late at night, built a connection neither had anticipated. She was saving his life, yes, but in doing so she was slowly winning his heart. Jonathan, who had once been resigned to death, now found himself thinking of a future he had never dared to imagine. A life where his children were safe, his home secure, and perhaps a wife he could love truly. The fever that had once threatened to claim him had now become a bridge between two souls, forged in pain, necessity, and unexpected tenderness. By the end of the first month, Jonathan's fever had broken completely. His strength returned little by little, and with it the spark of life and humor that had long been dimmed by illness. One morning, as Margaret handed him a cup of tea, he looked at her, a soft smile breaking across his face. "I think I've fallen in love with you," he admitted quietly, almost afraid to speak it aloud. Margaret's chest tightened, and she felt a warmth that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had entered this valley to save a family, never expecting to fall for the man she was tasked to marry. Yet now in his eyes she saw gratitude, trust, and something deeper, a mutual recognition of what they had endured together. I think I've fallen for you too," she confessed, her voice barely more than a whisper. The children, hearing their parents' words, glanced at one another with wide eyes, sensing the shift in the air, the transformation from a marriage of necessity to a family united by love. Margaret knew that life on the frontier would not be easy. There were storms to weather, cattle to tend, and neighbors who would always watch, judge, and gossip. But in this small valley, with the man she had married and the children she now cared for as her own, she felt the first stirring of hope and belonging she had ever known. And as the sun set behind the hills, casting golden light over the ranch, Margaret whispered a promise to herself and to the family she had saved. No matter what comes, we will survive. And love will see us through. If you loved the courage and heart of this frontier love story, make sure to subscribe, like, share, and comment below. Your support brings more epic Wild West legends and emotional frontier stories to life. Winter came early to Dry Creek Valley that year. The wind howled through the pines like a restless spirit, whipping snow against the edges of the homestead and rattling the wooden shutters. Margaret Whitfield rose before dawn, wrapping herself in layers of wool, her breath misting in the frigid air. She had never thought the frontier could feel so alive and so deadly at the same time, so starkly beautiful and cruel. Jonathan Callahan had grown stronger, but the disease that had nearly claimed him lingered, leaving him exhausted and feverish at odd intervals. His children, too, had weaknesses she could not ignore. The youngest, Daniel, often woke screaming from nightmares, coughing through the cold night, while Clara, the eldest, spent hours tending to her brother and her father with a maturity that no child should have had. Margaret moved from room to room, administering medicine, stirring porridge, and whispering reassurances she barely felt she had the right to give. The wind shook the roof, and she imagined it might sweep them all away like dust. But she pressed on because the frontier demanded more than hope. It demanded action, endurance, and courage. Jonathan watched her, silent and reflective, as she went about her duties. He could no longer deny the depth of his feelings for her, though he struggled with shame and pride. He had been raised to believe that a man should never owe a woman, that love was a luxury for those untouched by hardship. Yet here she was, his wife in every sense that mattered, risking her health, her safety, her very life for him and his children. And he loved her already, more deeply than he could articulate. "Margaret," he said one evening, his voice hoarse, "do you ever regret this? Marrying me?" She paused, hands steadying the candle on the table as she measured out medicine. Her eyes met his, and she shook her head. "I knew what I was doing, Jonathan. Saving your family, saving you. It was never about regret. It was about what had to be done." He smiled weakly, a shadow of warmth in the candlelight. "And yet, I see it in your eyes. You care for more than duty." Her breath caught. She did care, so much that it frightened her. Every touch, every glance, every shared silence drew her closer to him. She had entered the valley as a healer, a stranger, a rescuer. But now she was something else entirely. A wife, a confidant, someone who could not imagine leaving this place, these people, even if the frontier tried to crush her. The night settled over the valley, bringing with it a deeper cold. Margaret checked the children's rooms, ensuring they had blankets pulled tightly, that the fire burned low but steady. When she returned to Jonathan's room, she found him staring out the window, the moonlight illuminating his pale, recovering face. "I worry for them," he said softly, "for Daniel and Clara. They've seen more suffering than any child should." "You've given them hope," Margaret replied. "That counts for more than you realize." He turned to her, his eyes lingering on hers. "And for me? You've given me purpose," she whispered. "And more than I expected." Outside, the wind shifted. The valley groaned under the weight of snow, the ranch groaning as if it too felt the strain. Margaret and Jonathan had little time to savor the warmth of mutual affection. The frontier demanded vigilance. The following week, a neighbor arrived at the ranch, riding a horse exhausted and spattered with mud. It was Elias Trent, a seasoned rancher from the next valley over, known for his blunt words and keen eye. "Dr. Whitfield," he said, tipping his hat, "I've heard troubling news. There's a fever moving east from these hills, scorched by winter, fueled by poor shelter and close quarters. If it reaches here, your family, your husband, your children might not stand a chance." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "How many are infected?" 3 dozen last I saw," Elias said. "And it spreads fast." Jonathan stiffened. "Then we prepare," he said, determination creeping into his voice despite lingering weakness. "Margaret, what do we need?" Margaret ran through a mental list. Herbs from the valley, disinfecting solutions, blankets for the sick, isolation for the children if the fever reached them. "We'll need to quarantine the children in the loft near the fire. You must remain in bed, Jonathan, and eat sparingly until we stabilize them. The medicine will hold the fever, but your strength, that's up to you." The following days were a blur. Margaret moved like a shadow through the house, applying poultices, boiling water for sterilization, whispering prayers she had long stopped voicing aloud. The children huddled near her, their hands sticky from herbal salves, their faces pale but alert. Jonathan lay in bed, groaning occasionally, but watching her with awe and quiet gratitude. One evening, as Margaret cleaned his wounds and administered a dose of tonic, Jonathan reached for her hand. His fingers were weak, trembling, yet insistent. I don't know what I would do without you," he whispered. "You don't have to," she replied, squeezing his hand gently. "You have your children, your home, your life. And soon you'll have health again." He chuckled faintly. "I think I'm in love with you already." Margaret's breath caught. She had expected affection, gratitude even, but not confession. Not so soon, not so raw. "And I with you," she said softly, leaning closer, feeling the warmth of him through the thin covers. "But we must focus on survival first." Outside, the wind rattled the roof, and the snow fell heavier than ever. One night the fever struck Jonathan anew, hotter and more dangerous than before. Margaret worked tirelessly through the long hours, wet towels on his forehead, tinctures at his lips, coaxing strength back into his body. She hardly slept, barely ate, and the children, sensing the danger, whispered constant prayers into the night. It was during this fevered vigil that Jonathan murmured a name, her name, through delirium. "Margaret, stay, don't leave." Tears burned her eyes. "I won't," she whispered. "I'm here, always." When dawn came, Jonathan's fever finally broke. He coughed weakly, then opened his eyes, seeing Margaret at his side. "You saved me," he said. "I promised I would," she replied, brushing snowflakes from her coat, from her hair. "And I always keep my promises." The children cheered softly from the doorway, relief flooding the small room. Jonathan's eyes swept over them, then lingered on Margaret, a gratitude so deep it made his voice shake. "I owe you everything," he said, voice trembling. "My life, my family, my heart." Margaret smiled, feeling the weight of months of fear and exhaustion lift slightly. "Then we rebuild," she said, "together." But the frontier had not finished testing them. Word of a traveling blight, fever, sickness, and even bandits preying on weak settlements spread quickly through the valleys. A small posse of men arrived at Dry Creek one evening, demanding payment for supplies, threatening the children, and scoffing at the doctor who had married the rancher. Jonathan rose from bed, still weak, but fire ignited in his eyes. "Leave my family," he warned, gripping a rifle. "Or face me." Margaret placed a hand on his arm, steadying him. "I can handle this," she said, stepping forward with a calmness born of long years in frontier medicine and life-and-death situations. The men hesitated, sensing her resolve, and slowly withdrew, leaving the family shaken but unharmed. That night, as they huddled around the fire, Jonathan whispered, You saved more than my life, Margaret. You saved my soul. And you've shown me," she said softly, brushing his damp hair from his forehead, "that love is as much about courage as it is about care. We've survived the fever, the isolation, the fear, and yet we are stronger for it." The children slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, and for a fleeting moment, the valley seemed still. The wind softened, and the snow glistened under the moonlight like a promise. Margaret knew the battle was not yet over. Disease, death, and the harsh frontier would always challenge them. But she also knew something else, that love had taken root in the most unlikely place, amidst suffering and sacrifice, and that it would carry them forward through whatever the frontier had left to throw at them. And in that quiet, fragile moment, she allowed herself a rare thought, that this marriage, born of necessity, might yet become the most extraordinary love she had ever known. Winter deepened across Dry Creek Valley, turning the river to ice and blanketing the ranch in a thick, blinding snow. The frontier had a way of testing even the strongest hearts, and Margaret Whitfield felt it every morning as she rose before dawn to tend to Jonathan and his children. Each day brought new challenges, storm-damaged fences, livestock weakened by cold, and the ever-present fear of the sickness that had nearly claimed Jonathan, returning to strike again. Jonathan had grown stronger, but the illness had left scars, both on his body and spirit. He moved with a careful deliberation now, aware of his own fragility, yet determined to protect his family. Margaret watched him, her heart a mixture of admiration and tenderness. She had entered his life as a savior, a necessity born of duty, but now her feelings were undeniable. Love had crept in quietly, like a warm ember in the harsh winter wind, and she could no longer pretend it wasn't there. One morning, as she checked the livestock with the children bundled against the cold, a rider appeared on the ridge above the valley. Dust and snow swirled around him, his face grim beneath the brim of his hat. It was Elias Trent, the neighboring rancher, but this time his news was grave. "There's been an outbreak further east," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. "It's worse than the last. Families are losing entire herds, homes abandoned, and children sickened. If it spreads here, it will reach Dry Creek." Margaret's jaw tightened. "We need to prepare immediately, quarantine the children, stockpile food and medicine, and we must keep Jonathan in bed. His recovery is too fragile to risk exposure." Jonathan, listening from the porch, placed a hand over hers. "Margaret, I trust you. Do what you must. I'll follow your guidance, no matter how hard." Days stretched into weeks as Margaret worked tirelessly. She boiled water, prepared remedies, and monitored every cough, fever, and tremor in the children and her husband. The valley became a fortress of care, discipline, and hope. Despite her exhaustion, she refused to waver, knowing that the lives of those she had sworn to protect depended entirely on her skills and judgment. During one particularly harsh blizzard, a traveler stumbled onto the ranch, a young man, frostbitten and delirious, carrying word of a family in a distant valley overwhelmed by disease and death. Margaret recognized the signs immediately. Smallpox, complicated by secondary infections that could easily kill. She sprang into action, gathering supplies, medicating the children for precautionary measures, and stabilizing Jonathan with heated blankets and tonics. Even in the midst of this chaos, the bond between Margaret and Jonathan deepened. Small gestures, a shared blanket during the long nights, a gentle hand to steady a trembling child, whispered encouragements, cemented their connection. Love, born of duty and survival, had begun to flourish genuinely. One evening, as the storm raged outside, Jonathan whispered, "Margaret, what if this love, this life, isn't meant to last? The valley is harsh, the world unforgiving. His voice faltered. She placed her hand over his, steady and warm. "Jonathan, life is never guaranteed. But what we choose now, in this moment, matters more than what the world might take from us. I love you, and I will stay by your side no matter what comes." His eyes, reflecting the flickering firelight, softened. "And I you," he murmured, even if I fall again, I would not want anyone else at my side." The storm eventually passed, leaving the valley glittering under a fresh layer of snow. But the frontier's challenges were far from over. Bandits, aware of the isolated ranch, attempted to raid the livestock, unaware that the Callahan home was now a fortress of vigilance and care. Jonathan, still regaining strength, rose to defend his family, rifle in hand, while Margaret directed the children to safety and prepared medical aid for any injuries. The confrontation was tense but brief. The bandits, sensing the resolve in the house and the strength of a doctor who was no ordinary frontier woman, retreated into the storm. The event left Jonathan deeply moved. "Margaret, you're extraordinary," he said, his voice thick with admiration, "not just as a doctor, but as the heart of this home." She smiled faintly. "We survived together. That is all that matters." As the weeks passed, Margaret's presence became indispensable not only to Jonathan and his children, but to the broader valley community. Families came seeking her expertise, grateful for her knowledge and compassionate care. The stories of the frontier doctor who married a dying rancher to save his family spread like wildfire, and soon neighbors whispered of her bravery, skill, and relentless devotion. Amid this rising notoriety, Margaret found herself facing a profound internal struggle. She had entered the marriage out of necessity, yet now she was experiencing something deeper, more complex, a love that was mutual, passionate, and tender, yet shadowed by the fragile nature of Jonathan's recovery. Every glance, every touch, every shared laugh or quiet conversation carried the weight of both survival and emerging desire. One night, as the family sat around the fire, Jonathan took Margaret's hand in his, drawing her close. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, voice low and intimate, "what life would have been like if the fever had taken me before you arrived?" Margaret's eyes glistened with tears. "I don't allow myself to think of that. I only know that you lived, and that we are here, together." He smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I never thought that necessity could turn into love. But here we are, and I cannot imagine life without you." Their growing intimacy was not unnoticed by the children. Clara, the eldest, observed her stepmother with a mixture of awe and relief, realizing that Margaret's love for their father was genuine and unwavering. Daniel, too young to understand all the nuances, sensed the warmth and safety Margaret brought into their lives, feeling protected in a way he had never known. The frontier tested them still. Another outbreak, this one of influenza, swept through the valley, claiming livestock and threatening human life. Margaret worked day and night, often fainting from exhaustion, yet refusing to leave Jonathan's side or the side of the children who relied on her. Jonathan, inspired by her dedication, pushed his recovery harder, determined to rise not just for himself, but for her and the family she had risked everything to save. One evening, after a long day tending to sick neighbors, Jonathan found Margaret sitting alone by the fire, her face drawn, hands shaking from fatigue. He knelt beside her, placing his hands over hers. "Margaret, you cannot do this alone," he said firmly. "I can," she replied softly. "Because I must. Because the children need you, the valley needs you, and because I choose to be here." He looked into her eyes, recognizing the depth of her courage and the quiet, unyielding love that had grown between them. "Then let me share the burden," he said. "We are partners in this, in life and in love." And in that moment, Margaret realized the full measure of what had been born between them. Not just a marriage of necessity, but a bond forged in hardship, strengthened by danger, and sealed by the courage of two hearts willing to risk everything for family, survival, and love. As the night settled over the snow-covered valley, Margaret and Jonathan held each other close, knowing that the frontier would continue to test them, that storms would come, and that sickness and danger were never far away. But for the first time they faced the future not as a doctor and a patient, not as a savior and a dependent, but as equals, partners in love, guardians of a family, and survivors of the relentless wilds. And the fire burned steadily, a beacon against the cold, a reminder that even in the harshest wilderness, love could take root, grow, and endure. Spring arrived slowly in Dry Creek Valley, melting the snows and bringing new life to the land. Wildflowers pushed through frozen soil, and the river swelled with runoff from the mountains. For Margaret Whitfield, it was a season of hope and of relentless work. Jonathan had regained much of his strength, yet the frailty left by fever reminded both of them that life on the frontier was never guaranteed. Each morning, Margaret rose before sunrise, tending to the ranch, the children, and the community. Word had spread of the frontier doctor who had married a dying rancher to save his family, and neighbors came seeking her expertise: injuries from falls, illnesses from long winters, and ailments that no one else dared treat. Her skill was unmatched, her dedication unwavering, but the work came at a cost. Fatigue sat heavy in her bones, and worry gnawed at her heart. She had saved Jonathan, yes, but the frontier was unforgiving, and new threats emerged every day. Jonathan, now strong enough to ride and work alongside her, did so willingly. Yet he never ceased marveling at her courage. He watched her from the barn loft as she treated a man with frost-bitten fingers, saw the precision of her hands as she applied salves and bandages, and listened to the soothing tone of her voice that seemed to heal more than just flesh. He had entered the marriage expecting duty and obligation, but he had found something far greater: admiration and love that could not be contained. One afternoon, as Margaret moved through the barn, tending to a sick calf, Jonathan approached her, the wind tugging at his coat. "Margaret," he said, his voice gentle, "I worry that you bear too much. This valley, these people, it is heavy work. You've given all of yourself." She looked up at him, cheeks flushed from exertion. "I am not afraid of work, Jonathan, and I will not abandon those who need me." He stepped closer, taking her hand in his. "I do not mean to command, only to ask, to remind you that your strength does not mean you should carry every burden alone. Let me stand beside you as your husband, as your partner." Her heart ached with gratitude. "You have stood beside me every step of the way, Jonathan. I only hope that in the end I can be enough for you as well." Their bond, forged in crisis, had grown into something profound. They shared quiet moments in the evenings, speaking softly by the fire, laughing at the children's antics, and occasionally allowing themselves a touch or kiss that spoke more than words ever could. The love that had begun as necessity now bloomed into a tenderness neither had anticipated, but the frontier never allowed peace for long. One evening, a rider arrived at the ranch, breathless and urgent, delivering news that would test them all. A fever outbreak had struck a neighboring valley, and the local authorities, unprepared and overwhelmed, feared it would spread. Reports spoke of families collapsing, livestock dying, and entire communities on the brink of despair. Margaret's mind raced. "We must prepare," she said, urgency threading her voice. "We cannot allow this to touch Dry Creek." Jonathan nodded, resolute. "Then we act. Together." The following days became a whirlwind of preparation. Margaret organized quarantines, gathered supplies, and treated the sick with the precision and compassion that had already earned her renown. Jonathan worked alongside her, reinforcing shelters, tending to animals, and ensuring the children were safe. Yet the relentless pace began to take a toll. Margaret's hands bore the marks of long hours of labor, her back ached, and sleep became a rare luxury. Still, she pressed on, driven by duty, love, and the unyielding determination to protect those she had vowed to save. And through it all, Jonathan never left her side. He brought her meals, comforted the children, and took shifts watching the sick, ensuring that Margaret could find brief moments to rest. One night, as a fierce wind rattled the windows and snow drifted against the door, Margaret and Jonathan found themselves alone in the parlor. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the room. Jonathan took her hands in his eyes searching hers. "Margaret," he whispered, "I have seen so much suffering, so much death. But I have also seen something extraordinary. You are extraordinary." Her lips trembled with emotion. "I only do what must be done," she replied, though her heart betrayed the truth. She had done more than what was required. She had given herself fully to this family, to this life, to the man she loved. Jonathan drew her closer. "No, Margaret, it is more than duty. It is love. And I—" A sudden crash interrupted them. The door burst open and two men stumbled in, faces grim, weapons drawn. Bandits. They had heard of the rancher's recovery and the doctor's presence, and they saw an opportunity in the isolation of the frontier. Jonathan reacted instantly, stepping in front of Margaret. "Leave this house," he barked, hand on his rifle. Margaret, steady despite the danger, stepped forward. "You will harm no one here," she said calmly. "I am a doctor, and I will defend these lives." The bandits hesitated, sensing the quiet authority in her voice. Margaret's eyes met Jonathan's, a silent exchange of trust and resolve. The confrontation was tense, lasting only minutes, but it cemented something vital. Together they were unbreakable. The bandits fled into the night, leaving the family unharmed but shaken. As silence returned, Jonathan took her hands again. "Margaret, I never imagined life could be like this. Danger, disease, and yet love. I never imagined it either," she said softly. "But here we are." The children emerged from their rooms, faces pale but hopeful. Clara and Daniel embraced their mother, sensing the strength she had brought to their home. And for the first time, all of them, rancher, doctor, and children, felt a fragile, precious peace settle over the valley. In the quiet that followed, Margaret allowed herself a moment of reflection. The frontier had tested her, challenged her, and demanded everything she had to give. But it had also given her something she had never anticipated: a family, love, and a life worth protecting. And as she looked across the room at Jonathan, whose eyes held both gratitude and admiration, she knew that the bond forged in crisis had transformed into something enduring, a love that could survive the harshest winter, the deadliest disease, and the relentless frontier itself. The valley was quiet that morning, the sun glinting off snow-melt streams, but the peace belied the danger lingering on the horizon. Margaret Whitfield had spent months tending to Jonathan, the children, and the surrounding community. Her hands bore the marks of tireless labor. Her heart carried the weight of love and fear intertwined. Jonathan had regained full strength, walking and riding without hesitation, yet his past illness had left a permanent reminder. Life on the frontier was fragile. The children were thriving, their laughter echoing across the valley. But Margaret sensed that the final test was coming. It arrived one afternoon in the form of a rider, breathless and frantic, carrying news that shook the ranch to its core. A fever, deadlier than any Margaret had encountered, was sweeping through neighboring settlements, and reports suggested it would reach Dry Creek within days. Panic, fear, and uncertainty rippled through the valley. Margaret sprang into action. She quarantined the children, fortified the homestead, and began preparing remedies with meticulous care. Jonathan worked alongside her, determined to support the woman who had saved his life and nurtured his family. Yet amidst the chaos there was a quiet intimacy between them, a love that had grown steadily from the earliest days of necessity to a profound bond forged in hardship and trust. They shared glances in the flickering firelight, touched hands in fleeting moments, and whispered words of affection when the children were asleep. Their marriage, born of survival, had blossomed into something neither had expected, a love deep enough to withstand the harshest trials of the frontier. One night, as snow fell thick and silent, Jonathan sat beside Margaret, his hands holding hers gently. "Margaret," he said softly, "I cannot imagine life without you. You've given me strength, hope, and love. You've made this valley, our home, a place worth fighting for." Tears filled her eyes. "And you've shown me that love can grow even in the harshest conditions, Jonathan. That life, no matter how fragile, is worth protecting and cherishing." But the frontier had one final challenge for them. As the fever approached Dry Creek, a group of settlers arrived, desperate and sick, bringing with them the harsh reality that Margaret's skills would be tested to the limit. families huddled together, children weeping, and the air was thick with fear. Margaret worked tirelessly, treating the sick with precision, calm, and compassion. Jonathan assisted, fetching supplies, tending to the weak, and providing comfort where words alone could not reach. Days turned into nights, and nights into endless toil. The ranch became a sanctuary, a beacon of hope amidst sickness and uncertainty. Margaret's knowledge, courage, and dedication saved countless lives, but the effort came at a personal cost. Fatigue gnawed at her, and she often collapsed into bed only to rise hours later, driven by duty, love, and an unwavering determination to protect the family she had sworn to save. Through it all, Jonathan's love remained a constant. He watched her with admiration, helped where he could, and reminded her that she was not alone. Their bond, tested by illness, danger, and the relentless demands of frontier life, had solidified into a partnership that transcended mere marriage. They were equals, lovers, and protectors of a family and community that relied upon them completely. One evening, as the fever finally began to recede from the valley, Margaret sat with Jonathan near the fire, children asleep in the loft above. The room was warm, the firelight dancing across their faces, and for the first time in months the two could simply be together without the pressing weight of illness and responsibility. Jonathan took her hands in his, eyes shining with emotion. "Margaret, I know this marriage began as necessity, but it has become everything I ever hoped for. You saved my life, my family, and my heart. I love you, truly and completely." Margaret's breath caught. "And I love you, Jonathan. Not just as my husband, but as the man who trusted me, fought alongside me, and showed me that love can flourish even in the hardest of places." They embraced, the warmth of the fire matching the warmth of their hearts. The frontier outside might remain harsh, unpredictable, and unforgiving, but inside the homestead, love, resilience, and hope flourished. The following morning, the valley began to awaken with renewed energy. The sick had recovered, the children thrived, and neighbors praised Margaret's skill and courage. Yet for all the praise and admiration, Margaret and Jonathan found their greatest reward in each other. Every glance, every smile, every touch was a reminder of what they had endured and what they had built together. A home, a family, and a love forged in hardship. Weeks later, as the sun rose high over Dry Creek Valley, Jonathan stood with Margaret on the porch, gazing out over the snow-melt rivers and green fields. "We've survived the fever, the storms, and the dangers of the frontier," he said. "But more importantly, we've found each other, and that is more precious than any victory or survival." Margaret smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "We've done it together, Jonathan, and together we will face whatever comes next." The children joined them, laughter and excitement filling the air as they ran across the fields, unaware of the life and death struggles that had brought them here. Margaret watched them, heart full, knowing that she had fulfilled her promise. She had saved a family, protected a home, and found love in the process. As the family embraced on the porch, the frontier beyond remained wild, unpredictable, and sometimes cruel. But within the walls of the Callahan homestead, hope, love, and resilience reigned supreme. Margaret Whitfield had come to Dry Creek Valley as a healer, a stranger, and a savior, but she had remained as much more, a wife, a protector, and the heart of a family that would endure long after the fever, the storms, and the dangers had passed. And as the sun set over the rocky peaks, casting golden light across the valley, Jonathan whispered, "Thank you for everything, for life, for love, for family." Margaret smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "No, Jonathan, thank you for showing me what it truly means to love and be loved."